All right, thanks everyone for joining. We're gonna go ahead and kick off. So welcome to our webinar on Google Tag Manager server side, as well as some Google Analytics 4 components. Next slide, Kayla. So first, just for everyone, a little bit about Adswerve. We are one of Google's leading Google Marketing Analytics and Cloud partners. We've been working with the Google Marketing platform from the very beginning with all the various Google products. So anyone that's looking for any help or for any additional resources on this, just let us know. First, we wanted to start off with just a quick introduction of our three presenters for today. So first we have myself. I've been with Adswerve, I think for about 7 to 8 years, deeply experienced in all areas. Today I'll be leading the moderation component as well as the Q&A at the end. I'm really excited to have both Kayla and Matt who will be presenting all of our components on server-side GTM. I'll do our intro for both of them. So Kayla is a senior digital analyst. And to introduce her, I asked her for a fun fact. So Kayla, when she's not doing Google Analytics related work, you can find her on various aerial apparatus. And she also performs juggling. And I did ask, and she is able to actually do both at the same time. So quite a skill. And then we have Matt. Matt is one of our solution engineers. And he's been working with server-side GTM along with Kayla from the very beginning. And Matt's fun piece of information is he has a Corgi. He has not yet had his Corgi in any Corgi races. So I'm encouraging him to get into that sport. And he can also beatbox. So maybe we'll get a sneak peek of that at the end as well. So with that, we're gonna go ahead and get started. For anyone that has questions as we go through, the best place to enter those will be in the Q&A portion. We're going to handle probably the vast majority of the questions at the end of the webinar. We should have plenty of time to go through that. In addition, in our outro, we'll also share a variety of resources that we plan on sending all the attendees. Different resources to help you get started, kind of take things to a deeper level, and kind of learn more about some of the various topics that we're going to explore. So with that, Matt, why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
Hi. Yeah, so before I dive into server-side GTM, we can discuss just a brief overview of the traditional client-side GTM. Next slide, please. So overall, Google Tag Manager, it's a tool that allows you to just manage and deploy tags, which is snippets of code or like tracking pixels on your website without having to modify your site code. It's enabled for analytics team members or marketers to not be able to have to rely on the developers to add in certain code to work for marketing tech or analytics tech and ad tech. So it's an abstraction, and it helps governance with different sectors of your orgs, and also just speeds everything up as well. Next slide, please. So here's the traditional client-side GTM web container. Here you have the website, adswerve.com, and then the GTM web container. And then inside the container, you have your Google Analytics 4 web tag. And then whenever that's fired, say a page view, it's sending out a request, an HTTP request, to the Google Analytics servers that are owned by Google. In the request URL, you can see it's www.google-analytics.com/g/collect, and then the rest of the query parameters. That's very important to just note as going on during this further conversation. But go ahead, next slide. So what server-side is, it's server-side GTM. It's essentially the same thing, just bringing that abstraction of being able to add logic for your component to the server instead of just the website. So with that, you're basically able to do the same thing, just adding in that simple logic to handle that data stream and then passing it along to your server endpoint rather Google Analytics or Google Ads or Facebook or whatever. But it's really the most important thing is it's almost the same exact thing, same aspects as a web container, GTM. It has tags, triggers, variables, and then there's a new entity called a client, which we'll talk about a little bit further later. But go ahead, next slide, please. Thank you. So this is how a setup would be for a GTM web container sending hits to your GTM server container to a specific vendor endpoint like Google Analytics. So here it's very similar on the website adswerve.com, and then we have a GTM web container on the far left, and then a Google Analytics 4 web tag. So you send off a HTTP request to your server container, but notice that the request URL is a little bit different. It's the endpoint. It's different because you're sending a request to your server endpoint that's owned by your org, and that infrastructure is Google's infrastructure, but you own that project, GCP project, and you own that code. And in that middle is a server container. Now the server container, it's just handling these requests, augmenting it, cleaning it, whatever it may be, and creating that data layer, that data object, the data model, and then passing it and running the virtual container to the server tags. For this specific instance, it's a Google Analytics 4 tag in the server, and it's then sending off that request to your Google Analytics servers, or to the Google Analytics servers. So it's essentially just a proxy in the middle, handling those requests, fixing, amending, or augmenting, cleaning, and then passing it on to Google Analytics. Go ahead, next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, there is a new entity called a client. Now, in that diagram before, really all it is it's just listening in the front of your server container, just listening for HTTP requests with a certain URL path and certain request URL, and grabbing and claiming those requests. Once it claims those requests, it basically can build that data layer object or data object, and then passing it to any type of vendor tag or Google Analytics tag or Google Ads or Floodlight tags, and then waiting for those responses and then sending back a response. You can kind of think of it as GTM server side as essentially a airport, and you can kind of think of a client as a TSA. Go ahead, next slide, please. So think about basically your GTM server container is an airport, right? And you're at home, say your website is adswerve.com. Imagine that you're departing adswerve.com. You want to eventually arrive to googleanalytics.com. A GA4 hit would be having a URL endpoint would be g/collect. A universal analytics would be /collect. If you think about the analogy that I have here, it's essentially these requests are your boarding pass, specifically that endpoint, that URL endpoint, g/collect. Now, g/collect is specifically for Google Analytics 4, and /collect is specifically for Universal Analytics. So if you're sending in requests or you're going to the airport, the TSA is basically going to check your boarding pass, which is this, that HTTP request incoming, and it looks at that endpoint g/collect, and it sees that you are going to Google Analytics 4, or it's a Google Analytics 4 tag, and you want to go to Google Analytics. So it directs you to this correct gate, which is a Google Analytics 4 tag, and that sends you off to googleanalytics.com. Same thing with Universal Analytics. If you had a boarding pass for Universal Analytics, you're departing adswerve.com and you want to go to googleanalytics.com, you got to figure out which gate you want to go to. Server container will basically direct you in the right direction, and /collect for UA is essentially Universal Analytics tag. So go ahead, next slide. So here, to drive this analogy, here is a Google Analytics 4, as I mentioned before, the diagram from web container to a server container. And that g/collect is very important because these clients are looking at that URL mapping. And specifically for Google Analytics 4, it's looking for g/collect. Finds that URL endpoint, claims it, constructs the data model, and then runs the container and passes that data, event data, to the Google Analytics 4 servers, and then it's triggered based off of any type of event trigger that you want, or even other triggers, and then it's fired and sent off to Google Analytics servers. Go ahead, next slide. And that is my speech.
All right, now that we have a good sense for the overview of what server-side tag manager is, we'll dive into a couple of the considerations that you'll have to take into account when deciding whether or not you want to use server-side tagging. And then we'll do a quick demo just so you kind of have a sense for what's coming, which should solidify some of the concepts that Matt just talked about. So first, we'll talk a little bit about the benefits. First, privacy and data security is a big benefit of server-side tagging. Using a server-side proxy for your data enables you to protect your users' privacy, and in doing so, you gain some of the privileges with browsers that have strict cookie policies, which will soon to be all of them. There are a couple of things of note. Your IT team can put a policy in place that limits the access to certain APIs at a server level. So they really have control over what this technology can do on your website. You can update the data from an incoming request and either exclude it from an outgoing request or modify it, like Matt mentioned. So you really have control over what actually makes it to vendors. An example of what that could look like is you may have a user agent string or an IP address coming in from an incoming request. Maybe you don't want that data in GA4, so you can exclude that data from the outgoing request to Google Analytics servers before it gets there. So you really have full control over kind of what user data makes it into what platforms. And then probably what most of y'all are interested in is that if you have your server mapped to a custom subdomain of your own website, you can use a server managed HTTP only cookie for the tags, for your tags that will persist past the 7-day limit now placed on JavaScript cookies by the latest ITP update, which is a really big benefit of server-side tagging and probably a lot of why there's a lot of interest in this technology. The second point here is efficiency in data collection, and this really speaks to kind of Google has announced that core web vitals, so page performance, page speed, general user experience on your website are kind of now considered ranking factors for organic search, and also user experience is an important aspect of any website. You want to make sure that it's fast so that your users will continue to engage in it, and really this is a key benefit of server-side tagging as well. You can consolidate those incoming HTTP requests so that the JavaScript load on your website itself is decreased, and it puts some of that burden on the server container itself. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But basically, that just means that you can, for example, the GA4 client can cause tags to fire to Google Analytics 4 and Facebook and Google Ads, for example. So it kind of reduces the amount of requests that happen on the browser itself. And then the third aspect here is data ownership. So because you're using or you're routing the data through your own servers, through your own cloud infrastructure, you have full ownership and control over that data. Next, we'll talk a little bit about the challenges. There might be some reasons why you might want to consider not using server-side tagging, or what you might want to prepare before you move to server-side tagging. First and foremost, that is a consideration of resources. Because you're using your own cloud infrastructure to route requests rather than relying on the user's browser itself, there are costs associated with that utilization, the outgoing requests from your cloud infrastructure, that's called network egress, and potential logging. So the sort of utilization and storage of that data will incur costs. There's also a cost associated with the management of this cloud infrastructure. Server-side tagging is not a set it and forget it implementation. Continually monitoring network egress, logs, consolidating your data streams so you're not pinging your server with redundant requests. and monitoring your use of your instances to ensure that your server can handle the traffic being sent to it are all critical pieces to a server-side setup. And so knowing kind of, what partner you'll work with or having internal resources that will be managing that infrastructure will be really important to consider. Another consideration for resources is what's called client-side tagging. I know client has a lot of meanings here, but by that we mean the web GTM container, that normal kind of what we've been using for tracking so far, that web GTM container, that setup is still going to be relevant. You can send HTTP requests to your server container from any online connected device, but what the most common use case we expect will be is sending those requests from your web container, relying on a solid data layer set up the way that you're sort of probably already used to, and sending that data to your server container. That will be the typical flow. And so resources may be required to get your client-side setup on the website itself up and running and clean as needed for the server setup. Another consideration here is vendor adoption. So not all vendors have adopted compatibility with a server-side endpoint. So many of your pixels might still need to be in your web GTM container. It's expected that a lot of them will move in the direction of being able to first send those hits to server-side and then on to their specific server endpoints. But at the moment, it's not like 100% fully adopted. Google has created some easy ways to work with this, which you'll see in the demo. And then transparency. So it will be important to be kind of transparent with your users that about how you're collecting their data and that you're respecting their consent, even if they can't see those network requests. So, we've talked a lot about data consolidation and sending hits from, that are collected from one partner to other partners. And in this process, you'll just have to make sure that you're still respecting consent and have the legal basis for collecting that data within that particular platform. Next, we'll go into the demo. I will use the setup of a GA4 tag and a Google Ads conversion pixel for this demo. But first, I'll just kind of go over a little bit of what that process looks like, and then I'll jump into the platform. So before you do this, you have to create a GCP or Google Cloud Platform project, which is where you'll deploy your server. A quick note about this is you don't have to use GCP. You can configure other cloud platforms like AWS to serve the same purpose. We're using GCP in this example because it's pretty compatible and it's easy for a demo. Then you create the server-side container. GTM makes this super easy, and this will be the place where you build clients, tags, triggers, and variables like you have probably already done in a web container setup. Then we'll configure your a web tag to send data to the server. Excuse me. We'll create a client that will accept that request, and then we'll create a tag and trigger that will then send that on to Google Analytics. So kind of the full process in a couple tags here. All right, so first, I'm going to create a new container just to kind of give you a sense for what this looks like and how easy this is. So I'll just call it testing for now. So when you create a new container in GTM, you just select server. So they make it pretty simple, and then you click create. From here, I'm going to provision a tagging server, and this is in this example, I'm going to automatically provision a tagging server, which will be on an app spot domain. And this is good for testing purposes. Matt will talk a little bit about later about moving to production. And I'll show you just where you get to this outside of this pop-up. So where you'd normally find the container code, that's where you'll find where to automatically provision your container. In order to do this, you have to have a billing account for GCP. So you have to set that up prior with credit card information. That's a requirement for this since you can incur costs. I'm going to exit out of this because I created another example container here. So once you have a GCP account, you have your billing account sorted, you've created a server container, then you're going to configure the tags in your web container. So I'm using, and a juggling prop website as our example website here, but I have a testing web container set up here where we've got a few GA4 tags, a form submission, page view tags, etc. That we're going to use in this example. And in order to configure that all of those hits to go to the server container, Google Analytics 4 has made this super easy. It's literally just a check mark. The server container URL is actually what we find after we've automatically provisioned a tagging server. So I'm going to pull this default URL and make that the place where all of, my GA4 hits get sent. So I'm going to save this. And now I need to configure, configure a client. So I need something to accept those incoming HTTP requests from GA4. And luckily in a server-side container, the GA4 client and the Universal Analytics client are there automatically for you. We're just going to create a few or just change a few of these configurations. So priority means if there's more than one client in the container, then the one with the highest priority, the highest number, is the one that wins, and that's what will accept the request. In this case, we can leave it at 0 because there's only one client that's going to accept a GA4 URL, which is what Matt described earlier, that boarding pass. So we can leave that at 0. This default GA4 paths is just saying if it's G/collect, if they have the GA4 boarding pass, we will go ahead and accept that request with this GA4 client. We can ignore the second setting for now. You can kind of hover over that question mark to see what it does, but we don't need it for this specific example. And then you have more settings. So this is where we talked earlier about being able to use a server managed cookie versus a JavaScript managed cookie. Here's where I would set that up. Because this is a testing AppSpot domain and not a custom subdomain of my website, I can't use a server managed cookie here. And so I would change this to JavaScript manage, which just means that it's the normal GA cookie that you're used to. Rather than a first party HTTP only cookie, it's the previous JavaScript set GA cookie. And so I'm going to save these settings. Now that I've created a client, I need to create, something is accepting the incoming request. Now I need to have something evaluate the parsed incoming request and then send that data onto Google Analytics 4. So I'm going to create a tag to do that. Name it something generic for this example. Just like the web interface, I can create a tag. The configuration is super easy, especially for this example, because I'm inheriting what gets sent to Google Analytics 4 from the incoming request to our server. So I can override the measurement ID, or I can redact the user IP address, or I can decide to send a specific event and not others. I can change event parameters, add, exclude, etc. But for this example, I literally just want to say everything that comes into my server that has this boarding pass URL, send it on to GA4. And so we don't need to configure any of this, but where this becomes useful, say you have personally identifiable information being collected by the GA4 client, here's where you might exclude it. So no configuration is actually needed for this example. Now I add a trigger, and this is quite simple as well. I'm going to call it client GA4, oops. And I'm calling it that because I set it on a custom trigger. So you select custom, that's set to fire on the client of GA4. So client name equals GA4. And what this does is it says every time the client parses, or the GA4 client accepts an incoming request, parses out all the data into what's called an event data object, this trigger will say, now that that event data object has been parsed, all of the data within it will then be sent to Google Analytics 4 in the format that it expects. And so pretty easy, I've set up my GA4 tag. And I almost clicked exit. I'm gonna save it instead. I want to show a quick example of what it's like to set up a Google Ads conversion tag as well, because Matt's going to speak to that in a moment, just kind of how that all works, just so you have kind of a reference of what that looks like. So this is pretty similar to what you see in a web container setup. You have to create a conversion linker tag just like you do in your web container. You add your conversion ID, which I'm just going to give a fake example of. You get similar settings as you would in a web container setup. I'm going to just set up this conversion linker tag to fire on all pages. Oops, sorry about that. On all pages. And then, actually, sorry, I need to set it to trigger on forms because this is not a remarketing tag, this is a conversion tag. So how I would set it up to trigger on just forms is I would use the event data object that GA4 is going to parse. And I'll show you how that's done. So again, I'm going to use a custom event. And this custom event is from what the GA4 client is parsing, not a data layer event. And I'm going to set it to fire when the event name equals form, since I know that's how GA4 is going to parse that request. So if we look at the overview here, we set up a client, we set up 2 tags, we set up a couple of, or a variable and a couple of triggers to make sure that those fire. I would put, because my web container, this one, is not live yet, I'm going to go ahead and put it in preview mode so we can kind of see this in action. Oops, that's testing. I put my server-side container in preview mode and nothing's fired yet. I'm going to go ahead and fire a page view tag. And we'll see here, this is the event data object that was parsed by the GA4 client. If you go to the request tab, you can see that the GA4 client claimed the request. You can see what the incoming requests look like. And then you can see the outgoing request that was done by the GA4 tag. And this is the URL string that we know and love that gets sent to Google Analytics servers that we usually see in the network tab, but is now being sent by our own server. If I do a quick form submission, which I configured the Google Ads tag to fire on, we see that the GA4 client claimed the request and the GA4 tag sending data to GA4 and the Google Ads form conversion tag both fired. So we're going to jump back to our demo, or sorry, our presentation here, and Matt's going to talk about moving to production.
Yeah, thanks. Great demo, Kayla. Go ahead, next slide, please. So Kayla mentioned before about the subdomain. That's a very important aspect of server side, because overall, the main point of server side is leveraging first-party data. Without mapping a custom subdomain to your server, you're not going to be able to have server first-party data. So in this example, Kayla spun up App Engine. That's the default way to have a GTM server side in GCP, but there are other methods. But specifically for this, she had the default URL. You need to map the custom subdomain to the App Engine server using A or quad A records instead of a CNAME. That would probably be the first step right off the bat after spinning it up, is to have that mapping, because it allows you to enable first-party data and cookies sent to your server, but also just in general, there's a new aspect of server-side, which is that JavaScript or server-side managed cookie, which sets a cookie in the header response and then has a HTTP only attribute, not allowing JavaScript to affect anything for that cookie. And then the next step would be to just evaluate your server and just any type of JavaScript managed cookie. So that's another thing, is talking about the cookies. Currently, without server side, you're using a GA cookie, and that's JavaScript. That's a cookie that's managed in client side in JavaScript. If you had migrated to the server managed cookie, the default name is FPID. It's going to change the flow of how you use cookies. So if you're using analytics for a different vendor and you're passing in that GA client ID cookie value, if you're using that JavaScript or server-side managed setting inside your server, it's actually not going to account for that GA cookie client ID. It's actually going to just use a server managed cookie that's actually visible inside the browser, but it's only available to be passed via the server. So you have to make sure that your team, your marketing team or your analytics team, is aware of what these cookies are, what they do, and how they're created, and how they're going to be used downstream. Another aspect that you should evaluate before moving to production is evaluating the cloud costs. So there's you have to, even though, so when you're using GTM web container, you're not accounting for any of that costs. That's it's free. Everything's being ran on the user's browser, user's laptop or desktop. You're moving this GTM container essentially to the server container, and you're managing those costs. So all that CPU utilization, all that storage and memory, it's all being handled in your server container. Now, App Engine, I think the default is recommended from Google is minimum of 3 instances and max of 6 instances. That'll account for a lot of a high number of requests, but roughly it's like around 120 per month, depending on the amount of requests and amount of computation that you're doing in the server container. But you need to have awareness throughout your organization on how much this would cost. There's ways to evaluate it using the GCP calculator, but 3 main components really are CPU utilization, memory, and the outgoing requests from your server container. So when you do roll out to production, as I mentioned before, if you're using App Engine, when you first spin it up using automatic deployment, or even if you do that manual deployment, you'd want to be in that standard environment, and that's specifically for a server, or specifically for testing. You wouldn't want to move that or use that standard environment for production. What you're basically doing to move to production for App Engine, you're just updating, you're running a little script given by Google, and it moves it to a flexible environment. And that's where you're provisioning more instances to handle more requests and being able to auto scale and handle a good amount of requests. After you do roll out, you'd want to monitor. So logging is enabled by default, but it is costly after a certain amount of after it hits that certain quota. So that's things to consider. But there's also other attributes within GCP that allow for monitoring, to making sure that you're not seeing 503 requests or 500 requests. So that would cause an alarm, and you probably want to know like what's going on, and you can investigate within your GTM server container. Go ahead, next slide, please. So I dove a little bit into the cost pricing, but I can go a little bit further. So yeah, so as I mentioned before, you're moving that enablement into the server, and you're managing that server. If you're using GCP, then although that infrastructure is handled by Google, you're managing and you're maintaining that project in GCP. So each instance, if you're doing on App Engine, is roughly around 40 a month. So recommended by Google is minimum 3 instances and max of 6. Roughly is 120, but again, it depends on your location of your users and how many requests you are getting per month. And a good way to calculate it is their hit volume in GA. You have to account for not only your Google Analytics tags, but also any type of request from a vendor going outward, because if you do some type of consolidated method, pushing all that data into your server container, there's going to be requests sent out from each vendor tag, each GA tag, and so forth. So we have to account for that hit volume. There's other dependencies and factors for the cost, such as the number of tags and complexity of the tags and regions and logging and monitoring. So because as I mentioned before, that all that utilization of the computation CPU is being moved from the user and their browser to the server. So if you have a complicated regex logic inside your server container, it can be a little bit costly. So it's pretty easy to create tags and build out logic in the server container, but you still need to have a relationship with everyone in your org when managing a server container, just to understand different computation possibilities or certain aspects of managing a server container. Go ahead, next slide. Thanks. So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Google Ads tag and server side. So right off the bat, it's still using third-party cookies as of now, because Chrome hasn't disabled third-party cookies yet. I'm assuming when that does happen, they'll remove this third-party cookie enablement, but it is creating a first-party cookie called FPGClaw, and that's essentially the G-clade cookie inside client in the client side. One of the main benefits of using this is to reduce the client-side bloat, so you're not needing to load conversion_async JavaScript asset, and you're able to consolidate a lot of your data. Instead of having separate HTTP requests, you can have it one consolidated data stream like under a GA4 hit, and fanning out to a GA4 tag and a Google Ads, and also the conversion linker tag, reducing the amount of number of requests in a sense. Again, Kayla mentioned that it's the same configuration. You're adding the conversion action and conversion label. It's very similar and very easy to set up. Go ahead, next slide, please. So here would be a consolidated data stream. As I mentioned before, it's one GA4 tag sending off to the Google Analytics 4 client, and then there it fans out. It's important, very important, to have that conversion linker tag set on all page views, or else it's not going to be able to set that first party cookie FPGClaw. So the way that this works, and it's kind of a little complicated, so it's okay if you don't understand it, but pretty much it's that request being sent from the web container from the GA4 web tag. It's being sent to your server container, and there's a couple of requests that are being sent out. One is GA4 tag, the other is Google Ads conversion tag to account for that conversion, and then that conversion linker tag is being sent to set that first party cookie. There's a response back to the GTM web container browser side, and there's a mechanism that basically does a client side ping and sends out a request for Google Ads to enable for those third-party cookies. So again, you're still utilizing third-party cookies. It's not totally first-party data. So overall, sorry, I misspoke. Your server container cannot handle any third-party cookies. It's only first-party cookies. So this is why you have that enablement as of now. But I'm assuming when Chrome does remove third-party cookies, this little client-side ping was going to be gone, and it'll have a little bit more leveraging of modeling in the back end for not having this third-party cookie being sent out. Go ahead, next slide, please. So it's very important to know when you're setting this up, you have to consider consent. And if you have some type of consolidated effort, it's important to be transparent with your users. So here is an unconsolidated data stream where you're having specifically for Google Analytics for data up top, and then below is specifically for any type of conversions for Google Ads. It's still, you're not really consolidated, it's your multiple streams, but at least it's a lot easier to handle the amount of the processing and consent of your tags and your data stream. Google has done a really good job of helping with this, specifically with consent mode. There's features called ads_storage and analytics_storage that's enabled within GTM web container to help in help with and ease with this this process of managing the consents. Go ahead, next slide, please. So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the consent and privacy settings. Go ahead, next slide. So whenever I do talk to clients and stakeholders about using GTM server side, I always ask about how they're handling consent, and if they're not, I advise them to just think about it and talk to the legal team about it and how they would want to manage that. But it's important to have some type of relationship with your users and transparent relationship with your users. So server side is going to be leveraging heavily on first party data, and with that, there's also ways to send out this data and fan it out with no transparency. And that's not the best way to handle this, because this movement for measurement is for fully leveraging first party data and then modeling for data that's not able to be identified. So you want to have proper consent, and Google's provided a great mechanism called consent mode, as I mentioned before. And yeah, it's important to have awareness throughout your organization, because there's many different orgs. You know, you got your marketing, your analytics, and your engineering orgs, and many more. So it's important to make sure they all understand how it's working, how consent's handled, because not everything is available fully for consent mode. It's not, there's only a few custom templates right now for consent mode. So if you're using something like OneTrust, you probably have to do a little customization for a custom template for that, which is not too hard, but it's important to do it properly and to be transparent with your users. Yeah, let's go ahead, next slide. Oh, Charles, you're on mute.
Yeah. So thanks everyone. We're going to wrap up. So what I wanted to do is first kind of summarize a few key learnings, as well as cover some of the additional resources and recommendations we have. So hopefully, as you saw through this webinar, some of the stuff probably made a little bit of sense, and some of it made no sense at all. So to summarize a few things, I have kind of three key things I think to take away from this. First, a lot of what we covered actually had a lot of integrations or connection to GA4. And the reason this new version of Google Analytics was talked about a lot in our webinar today is actually because many of the integrations that have been built right now depend on it. So if you're getting started with wanting to send data to Facebook server side, or even the Google Ads connectors that Matt said, a lot of the out-of-the-box functionality actually uses GA4 as kind of the central pipeline. So this is where this new version of Google Analytics is kind of becoming more important. And just a little bit larger is actually Google's kind of move to GTag as the central repository for almost everything they're doing. So if you're getting started, just note that GA4 is kind of a requirement just because of the ease of out-of-the-box functionality that's being built in. Secondly, another thing you might have picked up on, and I think Kayla did a great job of connecting this, is that client-side tracking is still very much a requirement, even if you want to do server-side tracking today. And the reason client-side tracking is somewhat of a requirement is if you have an expectation for your marketing stack to have parity with what you're doing today, client-side tracking just is very much an integral part. And the reason that is because a lot of the things that we do with our marketing tags is about building audiences that we then can reach later through remarketing, lookalike audiences, and all these other things. And one of the requirements is you need some sort of ID for a user to find them later. And most of the ID space that we use today for digital marketing is either built off of first-party cookies or even more so third-party cookies. And even though third-party cookies are rapidly going away, a lot of our marketing integrations still use those today. And because of that, once you get into some of the libraries, like using the Google Ads tags as an example, they're still creating some of those cookies, even in those server-side instances. So the client-side tracking and the server-side relationship, there's still a bridge there even today. And lastly, I think the third takeaway is simply this stuff is complex. When we think of Google Tag Manager or a lot of Google solutions, you think of, I always think of ease of use as kind of a central component. And client-side Google Tag Manager is fairly easy to use, but it's still really complex, even with what we've had in the past, once you get into custom HTML tags and all sorts of the advanced integrations. And server-side takes that to a whole nother level. And Kayla, I think, summarized it best. Server-side GTM is simply not set and forget. It requires even more visibility and maintenance and updates and keeping track of cost and billing. So just know what you're getting into. It's not anywhere near as easy or as simple as client-side. With that being said, with all those 3 points though, we really do believe that server-side tracking is going to be an integral component of your marketing stack in the future, because this is where a lot of our industry and solutions are headed. I think all of us are in a place where we desire more secure and more transparent ways of how we send and structure data, and being able to reduce the bloat of all these client-side tags, being able to send consented data in more secure ways so we don't have risks of data leaking is an obvious win. And those are really the key value props of what server-side opens us up with. So with that being said, we have a variety of resources that we want to send to you to hopefully help you get started if you want to. First of all, we'll follow up with the resources that are listed here. We have onboarding guides. We also have intros to GA4. Matt and Kayla have both wrote some amazing blog resources. In addition, in our industry, if you're not already following SEMO has an amazing list of resources around server-side GTM, so you'll definitely want to follow his material as well. And then in addition, we will be emailing, again, all of these resources that we just listed, as well as the recording and the slides for this webinar. So again, not important that you retained even maybe 10% of what we were talking about, but as you're getting started later, these will all be great resources to kind of go through step by step to get started. So with that, we do have a few questions that we wanted to handle and go over. So the first question is either for Matt or Kayla. How long would you estimate it takes to actually implement server-side tracking? So let's say you wanted to do like Google Ads and enhanced e-commerce and Facebook. What is the sort of time commitment or length you would think it would take to do a project like that? So Matt, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, it actually varies. So if you have a very long list of Google Ads tags and you need to ensure that first that consent management piece is in place, and if it's not, you need to start talking to your org and understanding how that's going to be developed with the server-side flow in Google Ads. You'd want to do a parallel test and run a test tags and then along with your current setup and just evaluate it for yourself to see if there's data loss. If not, we've done it for our setup for Google Ads and then floodlights and then for our internal setup, and you've seen that there's only a little bit of variance, but it's important to have a good setup for parallel stream and then doing a cutoff when the time is right. So at least you need I would say probably like 14 days just for true evaluation of seeing a parallel stream and an evaluation and the cutoff. But you have to have a proper GA4 setup and also just understanding how you would consolidate, I guess, or if you want to consolidate.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Another thing that kind of comes to mind related to the question is one of the best places to potentially get started with server side is if in the past you have been doing anything with a measurement protocol for universal analytics or even GA4. If you're not familiar with a measurement protocol was a way you could send data from anywhere to Google Analytics. So as an example, for a lot of our clients we worked with who had OTT apps, like if you built an Apple TV or a Roku or a PlayStation, often you would kind of code your own libraries and send these HTTP requests through measurement protocol directly to Google Analytics. Or potentially, maybe if you sent some CRM information or whatever, you'd send it directly from your server to GA. Now, the challenge in the past was that data was sent directly to Google Analytics. So if you also wanted to send it to Facebook or your own cloud endpoint or anywhere else, you would have to go back into your app later and then build those integrations because there was no tag management component for server-side sends. Now, one real cool thing is you can easily go into a measurement protocol implementation today and simply change the endpoint and claim them in your server-side instance. And then from there, build the clients to then send that information anywhere. So one of the easiest places to see value is anywhere you've used the measurement protocol in the past. Our good friend Josh, who's attending, asked a question. Kayla, do you have any idea when Google might release floodlight libraries for server-side?
That's a good question. I actually don't know when they're releasing it. I know it's in the works. Matt, do you know what the timeline is?
There's no specific timeline, but I feel like it's coming very soon. Been testing it for a long time, so it's very soon.
Google's been working on that, but no timelines have been released. Another fun question, Matt, if you have any opinions. What type of logging do you think is essential? And do you have any recommendations on any sort of logging that should be disabled? And this is a good question because one of the things Matt alluded to was, again, you need to kind of pay more attention to what you're doing with server-side GTM because there are best practices and ways to optimize cost. And logging is a big component of that. So Matt, do you have any thoughts on logging?
Yeah, it kind of depends also. So logging is expensive if it's over that free tier, but it's pretty essential. If you have 503 responses, you're gonna want to know why and understanding possibly that there's too much header or data inside the headers of your request. So you'd have to talk to your team and evaluate what is important to capture, and that mechanism, rather, you could even incorporate some type of Slack mechanism. But I would filter if you are concerned about pricing but want to be conscious. A good method is just to filter only for 500 plus, but you'd want to expect or 400 plus, but it kind of depends on how you want to capture data. Like there's also ways to measure latency and understanding, maybe you need to change the architecture of your setup, because if you have just one app engine server project in US Central and you have users from all over the world, that's probably not the best setup. And if your organization is really focused on web performance, then you need to evaluate and change the architecture, possibly even set that up before you just set up app engine or migration. So I hope that answered your question.
Yep, thanks, Matt. Another question from Simon, how will ad blockers react to server-side tagging, and given it can now be used to circumvent ad blockers? So I'll take the first stab at this one. So I love getting this question because it really opens up some really important concepts, and Matt and Kayla both hit on these. Consent is a huge part of this, and more so just kind of taking a perspective of doing what's right and respecting users' choices. Now, with ad blockers, it's a pretty explicit signal from the user that they don't want to be tracked. So one of the things that Kayla, I heard she mentioned, is a lot of the server-side components are dependent on client-side. So if you're building a bridge from client-side where it's sending the server, it's actually likely or somewhat likely out of the box that some of that might be blocked in the first place, unless you've explicitly gone in and chosen to hook things up differently. And that's where, if you're choosing to do that, you should, as a best practice, be asking for consent. And if the user consents to being tracked and you're being very open about what you're doing with the data and giving them the right to opt out, both initially and later, then you're not running into that issue. And it's going to be consent driven. And you're going to, at the end of the day, feel really good about what you're doing. So as long as you put a consent flow in place where you're asking for that consent in the beginning, and then those flags are feeding to server side, whether consent is given or revoked and various subcategories of that, you're gonna be in a very good place. So the best practice there is if you're doing any sort of customization and going your own way with building collection pipelines, just think of consent and actually have it at the beginning, and you'll be in a great place. But the best guiding light there is do what's right. Let's see, we had a question. Do either of you have any guesses of when server-side GTM will no longer be in beta? Because right now it's actually has the beta label applied to it. Any guesses on that?
No questions. I definitely, or no guesses, but I'm assuming after, you know, the key products are pushed out, maybe, but there's who knows.
Yeah, I think it's important to add that Google has a long history of keeping things in beta for a very long time. Even Gmail was in beta forever. And in Google Analytics, even the existing universal version, there's still things in beta in there that have been beta for 5-ish plus years. So I think what's important is betas are something Google generally considers as very stable. And once something's in beta, they tend to not release anything that will like break it without lots of notice. Alphas are usually the ones that we put more scrutiny on and you want to be more careful about. But again, in general, just based off of the Google marketing platform of what's in beta, those have generally been fairly stable and things historically we can generally rely on. So personally, I've never been that concerned over the beta label myself. So with that, we're pretty much at time. So if you have any questions or you're looking for any help, you can definitely reach out to any of us. You can find us all on Twitter, just as our names, or LinkedIn. And you can also reach us at gethelp@adswerve.com. Other than that, you can expect to receive a follow-up. We'll share the recordings, the slides, all the information. Again, this was a very technical webinar. We tried to make it a little bit easy to follow through the demo portion, and also didn't want to hide really how technical this could be. And that's where you saw that through some of our diagram flows and some of the deeper explainers. So with that, thanks so much for attending. We hope to see you on our next webinar, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. So cheers, bye-bye.